Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. It was an incredibly moving film, John. Elie, you knew Primo Levi. You saw the film. What comes to mind?
Well, the whole period, the whole era, the post-war, immediately afterwards, what happened afterwards. We separated. He remained in the Auschwitz area. I went to Buchenwald. But the Liberation Day was almost the same. They were liberated by the Russians and we were by the Americans. Nevertheless, the reaction was almost the same.
Reaction for whom?
For us.
All of us.
Yeah.
But your experience was different because there was a death march in the post-Auschwitz experience.
That was a death march, of course, in January 18.
When you left Auschwitz before the Russians pulled the gates down.
They came in on January 27th, and we left on January 18 at night.
So was it roughly a week later, earlier, you had left?
But Primo stayed there.
Right, he was there,
yeah.
and you lost your father at that point.
Not at that point, later on, in Buchenwald.
Right.
But we were all offered the possibility of staying in the hospital. But we were convinced that the Germans would first kill the patients.
So the idea was to leave.
To leave, yeah. To be with the others, with the masses. Yeah.
And yet that resulted in also death, the death marches. Yep. John, I jokingly said that in my house the children love Zohan, but this is my favorite John Turturro movie, and also there's another film, the Illusion Defense, that I love so much. I don't know, you probably haven't seen this film in a while. What does it bring to mind for you?
Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to be sitting next to this gentleman. I read a lot of your books when I was, invited to participate in this. But for me, it was a great education. And I approached it with, humbleness and humility. Knowing that would be an impossible thing, really, to understand. And there's people in this room that, helped me a lot, in trying to understand it. I had a long time being involved. I was involved for about 5 years because it took a long time to get the money involved. So I got to read many things and meet many people, and I know all of Primo Levi's work. I met his family, and so it was a great education for me as a human being, as a person. And so, by the time we got to shoot the film, and I just want to acknowledge the person who was the operator and then took over as the director of photography, Marco Pontecorvo, and he's right here.
This is,
so well, by the time 6 years later, when film was postponed many times and we got to do it, I was very apprehensive that I would do a disservice. I just wanted to sort of serve those books as best we could in an unexploitive way.
I'm going to read to you something you told me back when we wrote about this, or I wrote about this. You said, "When I first saw the camp, I was wearing the striped uniform and the wooden clogs, and my legs went weak. I was very shaken. When you're behind the barbed wire, you feel the impossibility of understanding the experience because you know that you are ultimately free."
Yes, telling stories it's a strange thing, but I'm a good reader, so I kept a lot of books. Your first book very close to me, and Primo Levi's first book close to me, and it was a real seminal experience in my life.
The film, in many ways, was haunted. It took 5 years to make.
Yeah.
Marco is here, but that's because the director of cinematography died in the middle of the
film.
in the middle of the film.
Right.
The film took 20 weeks of shooting, which is a long film. Apparently, the weather was horrible the entire time. The director told me that everyone in the crew was totally homesick and filled with despair.
But if you kept reading what Elie went through, you realize, well, this is nothing really. So I tried to keep that in perspective throughout. And
Elie, this movie, it's a deceiving movie in the sense, because it's very hard to understand how we're supposed to feel. It is about the returning to life, the gradual returning to life. But that's the idea of choosing life, of re-entering the world after so much mass murder. That is not an easy thing to do, right?
In the past, maybe some 20 years ago, if not more, there were the first films on that period, on television. And they called a 4-part series called Holocaust. And I remember the New York Times wanted me to review it. I'm not a film reviewer, but nevertheless, I went to see it. And I went in hoping that will be something I would praise. I would say, finally, something of this magnitude happens on television. And we were there, a group of the New York Times people and myself. It was before the commercials, which were disgusting. But then, we were there, my wife was there with me, we watched it. And it was horrible. They turned into something kitschy, false. Everything was bad, not true. But I don't like to review negatively. I don't think I've ever reviewed negatively a book, surely not. But even films, why should I cause pain to someone who has probably invested so much in his or her work? So I said to the New York Times people, look, I'm too close to the subject, no, leave me out of it. But then they called me and said, look, if you won't review it, nobody will. And therefore, it's not good. So I wrote a review, gave it to them, and then I regretted it. I took it back. And at the end, they insisted so much that I gave the review. It created a stir. And then, for a while, I was doing a lot of these reviews, plays and movies, and unfortunately, there were very few I could praise. One of them I did praise was the Shoah, the Claude Lanzmann's series. I stopped, really. It's not for me. I write books, I don't do films. The only time I came close to films is, of all people, Orson Welles wanted actually to do Night. And it's not I am not in the film. I love good films, believe me. No, I saw the film Friday, and I liked it very much. I congratulate you with what you were doing.
But there's a difference.
Was it the same? It was not the same. Of course not. The Russians were exuberant. The Americans, no. The Americans were simply crying. The American army came. I remember a black soldier, and he couldn't stop it. He began sobbing, just sobbing and cursing the whole world. And as for us, I remember we did not begin to dance to express our joy and our victory. Simply we gathered, the group that we were in gathered, and we simply to say Kaddish, to say the prayer for the dead. But there was no rejoicing, not at all. With Primo, we discussed it a lot, Primo and I, afterwards, what the difference that we had. After all, we were in the same barracks.
Were you actually in the same barracks?
In the same barracks.
But I remember you told me you actually did you know him at the time?
No, because he was a very important person. He was a chemist. He was a chemist.
And just remind me, you were a teenager.
I was, yes, but
He was
nothing. I was really nothing, like all the others, you know. We were nothing. He was a chemist. It's only later when we met, and then, of course, we became very close, and each time we met, we had a lot of conversations, some depths. We have a friend here who was me actually, and we met almost the first time in Milano. And then I went back, I'll come to it later on, but Primo and I had good conversations on the subject.
John, I remember you telling me you too had a, not I would say uneasy relationship with Holocaust films, but you mentioned to me years ago that you really didn't like the Holocaust films that had preceded the making of the Truce, and you tried not to actually watch them.
We watched that. No, we watched
Oh, no,
it.
sorry.
What Marion and I, but we don't like it.
Right. Well, in your case, though, when you wrote that essay in the New York Times, that was actually, I mean, he minimizes the significance of it. It was a huge.
I remember that.
I mean, I don't know how many of you know what he was saying about how significant it was. The television show Holocaust actually was at that time the highest rated TV series, miniseries of all time. The whole country watched it, and in Germany, half the country watched it, and completely changed a very different conversation. Everyone assumed it was a good thing. Everyone said, how could this not be a good thing? And it was Elie Wiesel who first introduced the idea that Holocaust films, Holocaust art can be trivializing, that in the effort to educate, you actually give a false impression of actually what happened, and that you owe more to the dead and more to the living that it be accurate.
I found out later on that among their advisors were 2 SS officers and not a single survivor. Not any. They showed that Mordechai Anielewicz, who was the head of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, a heroic figure to lead an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which lasted 5 or 6 weeks, and he makes him into a kind of a messenger boy. Everything that was right was wrong. It was wrong. And I felt so bad, not only for the truth itself, which was violated, because I don't like to do that. I don't like to go and criticize a work for which so many people have worked with very good intentions, with honest intentions.
I think that when you're trying to learn about something, I would always prefer to read about it, because I think it's when you're talking about things that really happen, it's a superior way to understand something. The nature of film is a compression of time. And I've done lots of adaptations of books that are not about the Holocaust, and it can be very depressing, because the thing that you loved best about the book, the little details, they're lost. And there's a great sequence in La Tregua in the book where Primo Levi says they would go to these shows and they would watch this dance. It was called they would take their hats off. It was sort of the dance, this macabre dance of death or something, but they would do it as an entertainment. And for many of the prisoners, it was something that really symbolized their experience. And that was not in the script. And I remember being very disappointed and pointing out many things to Francesco, but the nature of a film, it's compressed, so it's not, it can air. And most films are more about the experience of the oppressors than the people who were oppressed. And,
Right, well,
and that's a different,
Schindler's List being the most obvious. Elie, this is also an unusual Holocaust story, and I hope you'll explain this to the audience, because Primo Levi actually gets to go home. He has his mother and sister. You and most Holocaust survivors were not able to go home, and you were orphaned by Auschwitz. This is a very different story, right, than what many survivors experienced, even the aftermath.
Sure, that's naturally, we had nowhere to go. In Buchenwald, we were 400 adolescents. The youngest one was 7. He was here actually last week. And we didn't know where to go. Nobody wanted us. So all of us actually signed letters to go to Palestine. The only place we knew where to go, Palestine. But the British had Palestine under mandate, and they refused to give us visas or something. Then the General de Gaulle heard about us, and he is the one actually who decided to take us in. And he entrusted the project to a French organization, a marvelous organization called OSE, that takes care of children and old people from the Jewish ghettos and so forth. That's how we came to France. It's only later that at one point, by sheer accident, that I thought that I lost everybody. Because still in Buchenwald, we stayed in Buchenwald until early June. And we went through lists of survivors. That was the main thing that we all did, lists of survivors.
And everyone in there was teenagers?
Some of them were before.
And younger?
I had two who were younger, 7 and 8. We went through the lists, and I didn't find my sisters. I knew my father died with me. I'm sure my mother and my little sister that night. But I thought my older sisters survived, but I couldn't find their names. That's why go back? I decided not to go back. And we were taken then to France, adopted by OSE, by one of those organizations. And I remember I came, a week or 2 weeks later, I came to the director. His name was Wolf, said, Mr. Wolf. I spoke Yiddish, he spoke German, not French. I didn't know a word of French. And I said, look, I have a great request. What is it? I said, look, I'm a Talmudic student. What I need now is a Talmudic volume. And he wrote it down. He never heard the word, but he wrote it down. And a week later, I came to ask him whether he got the book. And I heard him speak on the telephone. And he mentioned my name. So when he hung up, I thought it had to do with the Talmud. And I said, Mr. Wolf, did you get the volume? He said, what are you talking about? I said, you mentioned my name. Oh, he said, you are Wiesel, I just spoke to your sister. I said, what? Which one? I don't know, she said, I just spoke to her. I said, it's impossible. First, well, even if one of my sisters survived, how would she know where I am to call you? And then he said, look, let me try. She called from the post office. At that time, no, we didn't have telephones in every apartment. And they said, look, from the post office, and she went away. Now, she has a message. She's waiting for you tomorrow at a train station. We were far away from Paris. And for the whole night, I didn't sleep. I was convinced it's a mistake. I went to Paris, and there the oldest sister waited for me. And she, of course, they were all in Auschwitz and other camps, and she got married to a French Jew. At that time, everything was so fast. They married everywhere. And she said that the other sister went back to Siget to find out if I'm alive. But she came to France. And one day she said, a few days ago, I opened a weekly and there was a picture and I saw you playing chess in the picture. Well, I remember I played chess all my life then. And I remember in that Écouis, it was Écouis near Normandy, and we played chess. And somebody took a picture. I didn't know who that was. I never knew that a journalist was there to do a piece on that. Therefore, since then, I have a very great fond feeling for journalists. To the point that I became one later. That's how I met with my sister. I didn't go home. When I went home, it was 20 years later.
Was home there?
20 years later, I wrote about it. So in my memoirs, I went big 20 years later, not telling anybody I would come. It was fall. And I came to Siget, my little town, was in Transylvania. My father was born, it was Austro-Hungary. When I was born, it was Romania. When we left it was Romania, Hungary already. It changed hands all the time. Everybody wanted that little town. So I came, it was night, and I write somewhere, and I wrote a piece which I incorporated in one of my books, so the last night in the ghetto, before the transport, we became like grave diggers. Everyone from the family did dig to hide what our treasures. My mother probably the jewels, my father some money, my little sister a toy, and I myself, under a tree, I hid the golden watch I received from my grandfather for my bar mitzvah. So I hid it there. So that night when I came around midnight, I realized other people were living there. If they had opened the door, they would have shot me or killed me. And I began digging and found the watch. I left it there. So that was for me the return to my home, not for Primo. But you know, Primo and his family, Primo had a lot of problems. A lot of problems.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. You know, when I spoke to the director in writing this piece, John, you may remember this. He actually told me that it never dawned on him that he should try to film the first book, If This Is a Man. You remember at the very end of the film, you hear John as Primo Levi writing, and you hear him say, "If This Is a Man." In Europe, that is the title of the first book. In the United States, it's called Survival in Auschwitz. So for those people, you were actually...
It had many names.
It had many names. Yeah. For the same reason that the Truce in the United States is known as the Reawakening. So Rossi says to me, I would never have thought that I could shoot the film, the first film, Survival in Auschwitz. So I wonder, I mean, did that ever come up? Because apparently he went to Primo Levi to he received the rights to do the film only a week before his death, which we'll talk about later.
He was interested in the second book.
But only the second book.
The second book. I mean, obviously to do the second book, you have to really understand the first book completely, and that was really more of the guide for me. I did have a very bizarre conversation with Stanley Kubrick, who was a big fan of Francesco Rossi's and Mr. Wiesel and Primo Levi, and he wanted to make his own, for many years, his own Holocaust film. And when he wanted me to be in a movie, and he called me up, and I told him I had just finished La Tregua, and he said, well, why didn't you do both If This Is a Man? I said, well, I think that's impossible. I think one would be obscene to try to do the first book. And he knew it so well. He quoted, you know, pages to me verbatim. But I don't think that's so possible. I really don't.
Elie, I have two questions for you on this. The first one is the reason why The Truce, what we just saw to you, is a film that is watchable and absorbing, is because it doesn't take place at Auschwitz. Is that the difference to you that makes it acceptable? And then I guess a follow-up question, I assume since everyone on the planet has read Night, filmmakers have come to you, many, hundreds, and said, Mr. Wiesel, please let me own the rights to make a movie, and you must have rejected them each time.
The only time I almost accepted was with François Truffaut, who wanted it so much, and we discussed, and at one point I thought maybe because he understood it, but then I'm glad it didn't work out. I really believe that both Primo's first book and mine are not for films. I accepted your interpretation because it was good, because it's after. I don't think I could have seen you during.
I think when you read his first book and Primo Levi's first book, you don't read it all together. you read 20 pages and you put it down because you have to digest it. You can't read it straight through. It's not if you're going to, even if you want to, you need a break, within that. And also, when you revisit it, it's a different experience too. And I read that book, those two books, many times.
And that's one of the reasons it's unfilmable, because it's hard to even sit through it, even reading it. So how could it be watchable?
Chunks, I think.
John knows this. I don't know how many people thought of this, but there's a very controversial scene in the film. John knows what I'm talking about. The scene in Munich, which is at the end, where it's very powerful. Primo Levi leaves the train and reveals his Auschwitz concentration camp uniform and his numbers. It's very powerful. The German workers and soldiers stop, and then one of them, who you don't get a sense of what he's about to do, bows down in repentance. Now, that's an interesting scene, except in the book, that doesn't happen at all. In the book, the German simply walks past him, brushes past him, ignoring him altogether. So when I asked Rossi about this, he said, I had to provide some representation of repentance. Surely there would have been one German somewhere who would have done this. He didn't do it. That guy actually didn't do it, but I had to have someone who would. Now, speaking as a writer, a Holocaust survivor, a novelist, now that I told you about that very different perspective, do you have any thoughts about that scene?
I wouldn't have written it. But look, we are trying, really, we are trying to tell the truth. Just that, the truth, as hard as it is, as impossible as it is, but the truth. So why invent? Well, whatever happened, the reality was much stronger, more powerful than that scene. What do we need it for? He could have said really something else. Why that? He could have said there must be in Germany at least one person who would, but why show it? Why show it?
I think the scene, I had long discussions with him about it.
So what actually happened?
Basically, it was, he kept talking to me about Willy Brandt, and I said, well, Willy Brandt happened much later than that. It didn't happen then. I said, the scene, I think, works very well right up to the moment. And I think if he would have cut before he bowed down, that would have been the right way to do it, for me. But that was, it's a person's film, and Marco can testify to it. It's his film, but I felt the scene was very much truthful to the book up until that moment. I think it's very good up until that moment, and then it's a liberty that it's sort of unnecessary for me.
So you didn't agree with it?
Oh, I didn't agree at all.
And you played?
I didn't agree. I didn't agree. You never see my reaction to it.
Wow.
Because I had none. So so that's it. Yeah, that's it.
This is a Jesuit school, so repentance matters here. But in addition, there's a line in the film that actually is also in La Tregua, in the Truce, the Reawakening, and it's passionately delivered and it's very moving. And John says, "God doesn't exist if Auschwitz exists." Right, doesn't.
Cannot.
Oh, cannot, right. Cannot exist if Auschwitz exists. Good. God, you're a good audience. Now, Elie, you have faced this same issue in your own art. By the way, this is something I just want to move off of. Everyone in this room has read Night several times, but you've really made this huge mistake. This man has written over 40 books. And Night is good. It's his first one out of the chute. But, this man as a novelist, has anyone read The Gates of the Forest? It is just a knockout. Or The Fifth Son. Go get that. That is, everyone says, have you read Elie Wiesel? I read Night. That's not all of Elie Wiesel. He's an incredible writer. And in The Gates of the Forest, you've written so many books you may not remember, but I'll tell you. I got your back, Elie. There is a trial of God. in Auschwitz, in a camp, there's a retelling of a trial of God. And in fact, years later, you wrote a play entitled The Trial of God. So the question about God's absence or existence in Auschwitz has always been a great mystery for theologians and artists and thinkers of all kinds, philosophers. You started out as a Talmudic scholar. You ended up as a novelist. You're a humanist. You won a Nobel Prize for Peace. How do we reconcile this question of God and Auschwitz?
I don't. Look, I come, unlike Primo, that's where we are different. I come from a very religious background, very religious. I studied Jewish mysticism. I lived Jewish mysticism. Not only philosophy, which I studied later and so on, but mysticism. My attitude towards God is a mystical attitude. And therefore, for me, it was a personal tragedy with theological implications, naturally. Look, I describe in it, I used to pray every day with my father. Some Jew managed to buy tefillin, the phylacteries, for the few portions of bread from a Pole who smuggled it
Into the camp.
into the camp. And in the morning, maybe 100 or so would get up earlier, stand in line just for 1 minute to make the bracha, to say the blessing on the film. You may ask, why am I doing that? It's not even according to law. The law asks me to sacrifice my life only in 3 situations. Not to commit idolatry, not to commit adultery, and not to blaspheme God, that's all. Which means if the enemy says to me, sleep with this woman, may she be the most beautiful in the world, I should rather die than sleep with her. Or kill. You know. Only these 3, but not prayers. It's not written anywhere that I should actually sacrifice my life and to get up early and so forth. What could have been sacrificed for that? Nevertheless, we did it. And since I was a good student, I knew by heart many of the prayers, even the Rosh Hashanah, literally by heart. So for me, to this day, where is God? Where is God? And I have written, of course, in night, never shall I forget, and it has become, I don't, for what, some reason, I don't know, the basis for so much theological research, mainly in Christian, Catholic and Protestant circles. But it's very to me too, but nevertheless, I do pray. And still, in spite of God, I believe in God. Because to say, okay, Mr. God, you didn't want it, hell with you. I could have said that, and no one would have had the right to object. I could have said, Mr. God, look, all my life, my young life, I gave to you. You don't save your own people, I don't want you. Goodbye. I didn't. Maybe it was because I didn't want to bring shame to my grandfather and his and his and his and his. I come from a long line. I didn't want to be the first to say, to divorce God. That was the reason. For no theological arguments could prevail. Simply a matter of fidelity that I felt. I was going to die maybe next day. Look, I should know, I come, again, unlike Primo had a situation, I was always sick. My childhood was a childhood of a sick boy, suffering. By age 7, I suffered from migraine headaches to this day. From age 7. My parents brought me from doctor to doctor, from doctor to doctor, couldn't do anything, and then something very strange happened. The moment I entered Auschwitz, my headache stopped. The moment I came to France, they came back. And I have addressed so many medical conventions and so forth, and asked them. No one has an answer. How is it possible? That's how it happened. Go know. Same thing is with faith. Come on, I grew up in faith. And to say no, but at the same time, I do want to say no from within, yes. Unless I hate faith, that I can protest against that faith. If I have no faith, then what's the problem?
It's interesting with Levy because, you know, he wasn't really a believer, but he does, his view, I'm sure Elie would concur with me, encompasses that too. He understands that, and he is very appreciative and sometimes yearned to have that, I think, you know, in his own life. So it's just a very different point of view, but he wasn't dismissive of that.
We discussed that, of course. We discussed so many things, so many subjects, and that's true. And he understood me just as I understood him, actually. He couldn't tell me that he is religious because of his grandfather. I can.
I want to talk about something, actually the key point about Primo in a second, but I'm just curious, I think maybe people might be curious. The boy playing chess, the boy reunited with his sister, also had God at that time?
Yes. When I came back, believe it or not, I don't even believe it to myself. Because we were 400 adolescents that were brought from Buchenwald to France. And the first thing they did, the directors there and so forth, they separated the religious group from the non-religious, from the secular group. So we were 300 who went to other homes, children homes, and 100 of us came among the religious people. I re-became more religious than I was before. I didn't even think about anything else. All I thought was, almost, not the same words, I'll show you. You don't want me to believe in you, I will believe.
Well, that's a big spirit there.
Here's something that I'm sure, I'm almost certain most people in the room do not know. We just watched a film about a Holocaust survivor who reawakens to life immediately after the Holocaust. And if you read Primo Levi, with the exception of his poetry, but if you read his memoirs, you would know, and his essays, he was very much seen as a life-affirming optimist. He reaffirmed life. He reawakens to life, writes a book that becomes the basis of this movie of a slow, gradual reawakening, re-entering the world, trying to once again introduce oneself to what is civilization. And then writes his career about life-affirming things, and then in 1987 commits suicide. I don't know how many of you knew this in the room. John, I don't know if you remember this, but you and I appeared at a panel many years ago, I think at the New School, when this film was first screened.
I remember.
And I stupidly, they turned to me, the moderator said to me, I said, well, you know, this is an amazing film, but let us not, it was like the first thing said after the movie, and I stupidly said, well, this is a phenomenal film, this was incredible, but let us not forget that Primo Levi committed suicide. And then the room, by the way, this room was, John, it was like the Italian consulate or something. The room was filled with Italians, not Italian Americans, but Italians. And there was a rumble in the room. You could feel a palpable sense. And I turned to John and I said, what did I just say? And he turned to me and he said, well, the Italians don't accept that it's a suicide. And I'm just wondering whether this goes, because this in Italy still remains a controversy.
Well, there was no one who saw him, you know, fall. I mean, you've been to his house probably, it's a very tall staircase. When I asked to meet the family initially, they didn't want to, but someone had asked me what I thought about it. I said, it's not up to me to speak about it. I can only judge the man by the life that he lived and what I received as a reader of him. And I think that's the way a person should be judged. And I said I wouldn't ever comment on that because I have no knowledge of that. I did know, after his family did agree to meet me, that he was in a very difficult domestic situation. Very, very difficult. His mother was very ill and blind and living in the same apartment with his wife. I know he wasn't feeling very well. So there's other contributing factors to it. But for me, as a person who didn't really know him, but who's basically studied him for a long time, and I know his son quite well, I think he should be remembered by the life he led and what he contributed, and not the moment of his demise.
Elie, you, I know, actually spoke to him about a week, 10 days before. Less.
We used to talk on the telephone quite a lot. And that day he called. And we spent an hour or so. It was, I think, just before Passover, April. It may even have been April 11. April 11 is, for me, the liberation day of Buchenwald. And I felt something in his voice. I'm very sensitive to voices, especially to a friend. And after 30 or 45 minutes of talk, I said to him, Primo, I'm going to hang up, and you go to the airport. An air ticket will wait for you, and I am going to cancel all my commitments for the whole week, and you and I will go to be alone, just alone. He waited a very long moment and simply said, Elie, it's too late. You know, when you study tragedy, Greek tragedy, when you hear those words, too late, you know. I think next day, I remember I turned to Marion, my wife, and I said, I'm terribly worried. So it's what he said.
It's hard, I mean, in listening to John, you know, it's very hard. This is why the Italians don't accept it. They cherished him, he was a national treasure. And to think that a man who they loved so much could have been in this much despair, I think, was difficult for Italians. You know, this is the dark little secret of the Holocaust survivor writing community. With the exception of Elie Wiesel and Aharon Appelfeld and Imre Kertész, all of the Holocaust writers committed suicide. This is one of these things that people don't know. All of them, Jean Armeri, Piotr Ravish, Tadeusz Borowski, Paul Celan, Jerzy Korzynski, all people you knew.
Yep.
Is there something you want to? Can you comment on this? It is a phenomenon and a fact, and it's also very painful to imagine that the writers who lingered the most and thought about it the most, and as we know, Primo Levi's sense of detail, the observation, the exactness was so important to him. In the end, if it's true in his case also, couldn't take life anymore.
Years ago, I had a student, a doctoral student, and I gave her the assignment to do something on that, to get a PhD dissertation on writer's suicide. Not all, not some, but most of them did. Now remember that what we so poorly call the Holocaust had created a society, a new society, almost a new creation. A kind of parallel creation to creation. And in that society, there were princes and beggars and philosophers and theologians and businessmen, everything. They created a new society. among the different strata of that society, the worst was the community of writers, almost the race of writers. We didn't have that many suicides among others, among businessmen or about engineers, architects, no, mainly about writers. And for a while, really, I was puzzled by that. Why? And then it came to me, look, writers had only one obsession: use words. Words. Who is a writer? Who knows how to put words together and find the right words? And most of them, if not all of them, me included, we have the feeling that our words are not good enough. You said I published 40 books, so I've published, believe it or not, 60 books. Only very few on that subject, maybe 4 or 5. All the others are different. But about these, I have reasons to question my own judgment. I'm not sure that I have found the right words. On one level, I would say that if I had found the right words, the world would be a different world. We would have saved a generation or two. And since the world hasn't changed, maybe it's my fault, because my warning was not heard, because my testament was not received, and my testimony denied. We all have that, all of us, including Jean-Améry and all those that you mentioned, and Piotr Ravitch, whom I knew very, very well.
He's actually your best friend.
Absolutely. So therefore, I was not surprised. I was shocked and pained, desperate at what our good friend, but I was not surprised. All the things that you say, yes, he was famous, and he was, of course, he thanked everything. Well, that doesn't really weigh that much. But you deal with metaphysical experiences, almost mystical expressions. Really, that's truth. Truth, just truth. There is truth in all that. So I'm not surprised. I feel that could we have saved him? I'm sure if he had come to New York, responding to my invitation, we would have saved him for a year or 2 or 10.
The controversy really is also, the Italians would say, on the very morning of his death, the first thing he did was go to the synagogue. It was a Jewish community center, and Passover was a few days away.
I told you, yeah.
And he went to check to make sure that the matzah had been delivered. And then he went home. He bought, I think, some food. He was very apparently cheerful in talking to the concierge in the bottom of this building. And then he went up the stairs, and then he went down the stairs. So there were people who said, well, he was under this medication, right? This is where this comes from. I know that the received wisdom is that there isn't any question. But on the other hand, what John said is true. He was suffering terribly from depression.
Well, I said there was contributing factors. I'm saying in each person's life there's contributing factors, and plus being a survivor of that experience.
Right.
With that's all. But I do very strongly feel to lay on anybody's life, even the other writers, who I'm not as well versed in, some I am, but to make that the final conclusion of someone's life does a tremendous disservice. Because even if I was never involved in this, and I had only read the periodic table, these are books that are civilizing books that open you up, and that if you are a prejudiced person, and everyone has prejudice in them, it's a way of confronting that within yourself. And that is a major contribution to the world.
And we should remember
Elie says, he says, he didn't find the right words, but it's also the person who has to receive those words and who that person is. and when they're ready to receive it. And that's a big thing. And so for me, just as a reader,
Right.
as a human being, that was a major gift for me. And that's what I remember about him.
I understand.
And that's what I keep with me, not how he died.
I understand.
So.
All right. Let's take some questions from the audience. We have some of our Mel's students with microphones, so let's wait till you get your microphone. Where, any hands up? Over here. We should start with Annette Insdorf, I think. It's all the more reason. Right over there. Right there. On the aisle. Right now. Hands up. All right, there we go.
First, thank you very much, because the level of this conversation is so way above everything I hear in New York. I have a question about the fact that the film was in English, and I have a vague recollection that I saw a foreign language version of the Truce at some point, at the Cannes, an Italian language version. I'm curious for you, John, whether there's a difference in either in the making of the film or in the way we see it, whether it's in English or the original language of the experience. And also for Elie Wiesel, do you sometimes react a bit more harshly towards a film in terms of authenticity, veracity, when it is indeed Americanized into English as opposed to being in the original languages?
Look, I grew up in Yiddish. I cannot imagine that you would have done a film in Yiddish. But I'm open, really I'm open. Just one word we have not said about suicide. 1 year, I teach at Boston University. I gave a whole year the course on suicide. Suicide in literature, suicide in philosophy and psychology, or books where the character committed suicide, or books that the author committed suicide for a whole year. It was the saddest, the most distressing, not depressing, distressing course I've ever given in any university. So therefore, John, don't think that suicide, although believe me, we all read Camus about that, the myth of Sisyphus about suicide. And he said the only problem in life really is whether to commit suicide or not. He was wrong. It's wrong. It's not the only problem. He said it's the most important problem. Doubly wrong. There are other things. But nevertheless, look, if it's an act, not an incident or an accident, if it's an act, I think we should respect the writer who decides that that is his last protest. We may then give, of course, arguments not to. That we believe that life has more mysteries, and that life has more challenges, and that life has more blessings, as many, if not more, than curses. We may do that. We are doing that as teachers, as artists, as directors, but what you do with your life, but to respect it. And when I speak about those that I've known, like Piotr Ravich and so forth, look, they owe, we owe them the respect for what they are doing. It may have been psychologically wrong, surely practically dangerous, because if I had thought that in that year of my teaching that course, students, even one student, would come closer to the option of suicide, I would have stopped my course in the middle. I teach all that, the truth of it, in order to say no, although these people whom I admire and I'm close to, beyond their death, they have done it, but don't follow them, naturally. But in the meantime, they owe us the right and the duty to tell, but we feel that if they decided that, for them, at that moment, it was the right decision because they thought it was the right decision. Now look, I can give you examples, innumerable examples, of suicides that were a matter of a minute. It just happened. It just happened. Someone is in the kitchen with gas, and because it goes through his mind, that he opens the gas. It happened. can give you examples. It happened. No. Nevertheless, in this case especially, where we deal with someone who has left such a great body of work, that if he felt that is the last gesture in his life, I would say, look, I invited you, you didn't come, you had good reasons. That's how it is. Now, as for the language, I would have preferred it, again, as I said, in English. But for me, it's not the language. I speak English and French and so forth. It's the person who says the word that matters. Do I believe him or her? Whether they speak even if they speak in Polish, I don't speak Polish. There I have to see that the subtitles. But if I trust that artist, then it's okay. I accept whatever they say.
I agree with him.
We had a hand up here. We have a microphone. Hand up, please. This is actually, come on, find her. There we go, right here. Is it here? Oh, this is actually a Supreme Court Justice from Israel, Justice Arbel. I don't know if you know her. She's visiting here this semester. Microphone closer to your mouth.
I would like to thank you
Much
for
closer.
this exciting and powerful film, and of course the session, and all what we heard here. As you mentioned, I am a Supreme Court Justice in Jerusalem, and we always used to say that Israel was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. It was built by people who were survivors. Some of them were survivors who came from all the ends of the world to build Israel. And we are citing in many of our judgments the saying of Justice Barak, who was our, a premier president of the court, of the Supreme Court, who says that our values about human rights, our moral aspects about human dignity derives from the events of the Holocaust. That's why we should always remember, and here on behalf of the Israeli Supreme Court, I want to thank Elie Wiesel, that he never gives us forget, and we always remember, and he makes the whole generation remember what happened. And we saw today the hell after the hell, and we should never forget. And thank you, Elie Wiesel, and thank you, Professor Rosenbaum, for all you need. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Oh, we got some more back there. That gentleman. Oh, there, keep going. There you go.
Thank you so much for being here. This is a tremendous opportunity.
Could you closer?
Sure. I noticed in the film that the felt Star of David had half of it was red, and I've never seen that before. I was wondering what that indicated in the camps. Anybody could shed some
This
insight.
gentleman pointed out that he had seen this, the Star of David on the concentration camp uniform. He said he thought was red.
No.
Yeah.
I thought it was yellow.
No, it's yellow. No, the number.
Well, in the film I saw it was red
In
and
the
yellow.
film, he said, all right.
Yeah.
You know it. Yeah.
Whatever it is, I know it was. I can't answer that question. I know why.
Why would that be?
They have shown the political aspect.
He was political prisoner. That's right.
They had blue, they had other colors depending upon why they were imprisoned.
It was a long time ago I made the movie, so I forgot that detail, so I'm sorry.
There's a hand up here. Do we have a mic closer?
You're exactly right. Thank you. Yes, because he was a partisan. That's all.
To Thane, Elie, and John, this was a marvelous, marvelous discussion. And I just wanted to thank the Law, Culture, and Society at Fordham for hosting this. This was a magnificent, magnificent discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question, I guess, probably goes straight to Mr. Wiesel. I was going to speak at a conference on Gujarat and of the communal violence there. And I was just about to tell them that we should forgive and forget, and I was tugged and I was pulled away, and they said, never say that we should forgive and forget. And so my question to Mr. Wiesel is, do you believe that for humans who have done injustice to other humans, if those humans should be forgiven?
First, the name is Wiesel.
Mr. Wiesel, sorry.
Look, in brief, forgiving, no. Who am I to forgive? In the name of so many. If that said somebody would come to me, let's say here in New York, somebody in the street said, Professor Wiesel, you don't know me, but I was there, and I was a German. You were beaten up that day, I did it. Forgive me. I would probably say, go ahead. But to forgive for the entire people, who am I? I'm not authorized or spokesman. But forgetting, absolutely never to forget. Does it mean what? I'll give you an example. I was invited to speak at the Berlin Parliament when Bonn moved to Berlin. I accepted. I was there with my wife. And it was a very big thing for the first time, the first session of the Parliament in Berlin. But I came. Everybody naturally was there, the president, the prime, and the chancellor, everybody. And I gave my lecture about the meaning of memory and so forth. At the end, I turned to the president. I think his name was Weizsäcker. So, President, I said, look, Germany has done quite a lot for my people. First, for the survivors. You helped them rebuild their lives with money and so good things. And then you helped Israel, which to me, I'm so close. I identify, of course, whatever Israel does. And therefore, you gave Israel a lot, not only financial things, but other things. What we don't speak about arms. You have done a lot. One thing you have not done. You have never asked the Jewish people for forgiveness. Why didn't you? And why don't you? You can imagine the silence in that hall. Little did I know, a week later, he picked himself up. The name was Weizsäcker, President, Chancellor Weizsäcker, picked himself up a week later, took a plane, went to Jerusalem, to the Knesset, the parliament, and for the first and only time, he asked the Jewish people for forgiveness. You know, sometimes I doubt so much the power of my words. But I must tell you, then I felt good.
Elie, John, I feel so privileged by this friendship that you've bestowed upon me, and very grateful to the both of you that you've graced and honored our stage. And you gave the forum and this audience truly an experience for the ages. So I want to thank you both. Elie and John are going to leave separately, and then we're just going to have two brief announcements, and we're going to talk to you about a book, how we're going to deal with book signing, because there is, Elie Wiesel's books are here. So we're going to say goodbye with a great deal of forum gratitude to both Elie Wiesel and John Turturro. They're all going to go. I appreciate it so much, John. I really do. Yeah, you're all coming. They're all coming. They're all coming. They know.